The wind cut low across the prairie and found every place a body could still feel pain. And Mercy Holloway felt it first in her ribs, where breath came shallow and wrong. Then in her hip, where blood had soaked the dust into a dark rusted paste. And finally in her heart, where the knowledge settled that if the man kneeling beside her failed, there would be no sunrise left for her to see. Because out here, the land did not forgive hesitation, and neither did wounds that went deep. And Eli Calder knew this with the kind of knowing that had been burned into him by 40 winters and too many graves marked with nothing but stones. His hands shaking as he tore his neckerchief into strips, while the mare behind him shifted her weight and snorted. The only witness besides the circling hawks that already seemed to sense the balance tipping. And when Mercy gasped and tried to pull away as he reached for the length of cleaned willow he had shaved down smooth with his knife, her voice came out raw and cracked. "Wait, you're putting that inside me?" Not as accusation, but as disbelief born of terror, because pain had made her young again in that moment, young enough to still think there might be another way. And Eli swallowed hard and muttered. No time left like a prayer he no longer believed would be answered, his eyes flicking to the darkening blood, and then to the sky where the sun was already beginning its slow surrender, because he had seen this before. A shattered bone driven inward by a fall or a bullet, the kind that swelled and killed from within if not set right, and he hated himself for knowing exactly what had to be done. Hated the way the land had trained him to choose action over mercy. Yet even as regret clawed at him, he could not stop, because destiny in the West was a thing that came sudden and demanded payment in flesh or courage, and Mercy's fingers dug into the splintered log she lay against, nails tearing, breath breaking into sobs she tried to swallow back as Eli's voice dropped low and steady the way it had when he used to calm horses spooked by thunder, telling her to look at the far ridge, to name the shapes of the mesas, to remember her mother's hands braiding her hair by lantern light, anything to anchor her while he worked, and the smell of iron filled the air as he pressed the splint into place to keep her from bleeding out inside herself. The pain ripping through her like a lightning strike that made her scream despite all her will. A sound that tore loose something inside Eli, too, because it was the same sound his wife had made years ago when help came too late. And for a heartbeat, he nearly stopped, nearly let go. But the West did not allow men the luxury of ghosts when the living still needed saving. So he forced his hands steady and finished, binding tight, whispering apologies that the wind carried away. And when it was done, Mercy lay trembling and pale, eyes wide and wet, but still alive, and that was the miracle he clung to. Even as dread pulled heavy in his gut, because he knew the night would bring fever and the long ride to shelter, still waited, and as he lifted her gently, feeling how light she had become, he wondered whether survival was a gift or another kind of sentence, and whether the choice he had just made would save her or damn them both before the stars fully claimed the sky. The night came down hard and cold, the kind of darkness that pressed close and made every sound feel like a warning, and Eli Calder rode with Mercy Holloway bound against his chest, her breath shallow but stubborn, each rise and fall a fragile promise he counted like prayer beads, while the mare pushed on through the tall grass toward edge of the cloth. Because he knew there were moments that split a life clean in two, moments after which nothing fit the same way again. And as the lamp flickered and the wind rattled the windows like distant gunfire, he took a breath and gently pulled the blanket back. And in that instant, as the truth of what she carried was revealed in the yellow light, the world seemed to stop moving, and Caleb Rourke froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as the full weight of her words finally made sense. And somewhere deep inside him a choice was already forming that would demand more than he had ever given before. The truth he saw beneath that blanket did not scream or beg for mercy. It simply existed, raw and undeniable, the kind of truth that changed the air in a room, and Caleb felt his knees weaken as he took it in. The deep cuts along her thighs rubbed raw by rope and saddle, the angry bruises blooming like rot beneath pale skin, the crude stitching done by untrained hands that told a story of men who fixed what they broke, only enough to keep it usable. And worse than the wounds was the brand, burned low on her hip, crooked and fresh, a mark meant to erase a name and replace it with ownership, and for a long moment he could not breathe, because the past came roaring back, the war camps, the prisoners, the things done in the dark when no one thought God was watching, and Mara turned her face to the wall, voice flat now like she'd already stepped outside herself, saying she told him not to look, that now he knew what she was. And Caleb found his voice somewhere beneath the weight in his chest and said quietly that he knew what had been done to her, not what she was, and that those were not the same thing. And she laughed again, bitter and cracked, saying men always said that before leaving. And he surprised himself by kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand, not gentle this time, but firm, anchoring, telling her he wasn't leaving, not tonight, not ever if she didn't want him to, because the land took enough without men adding to it, and the silence that followed was thick, with disbelief, then with something fragile and dangerous like hope. And he spent the night cleaning her wounds by lamplight, hands steady, despite the anger burning under his skin, listening as pieces of her story came out in broken fragments, how a wagon train had promised work, how the border town swallowed women whole, how surviving sometimes meant trading one kind of death for another, and how she'd finally run when she realized a brand meant she would never be allowed to leave alive. And when dawn crept in pale and cold, she slept for the first time without fear clawing her awake, and Caleb sat by the window watching the horizon, knowing the men who did this would come looking, knowing his choice had already set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And when they came 2 days later, he was ready, standing in the yard with the sun at his back and his rifle steady, telling them no woman lived here matching their description. And when they laughed, he did not, and the gunfire echoed across the fields like thunder, finally breaking a long drought. And when it was over, the dust settled on 3 bodies that would never hurt anyone again, and Caleb stood shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross again. And Mara watched from the doorway, tears streaking down her face, not in horror, but in something like release. Because for the first time, someone had chosen her over his own safety. And the weeks that followed were slow, and hard and real, filled with pain and healing, and long silences that spoke louder than words. And Mara learned to walk without flinching, learned to breathe without apology, learned that the brand did not define the shape of her soul. And Caleb learned that love was not the grand, clean thing he once believed in, but a daily act of staying, of listening, of carrying another's darkness without turning away. And when spring came, the land softened, green pushing through scarred earth the way it always did, stubborn and unashamed. And one evening Mara stood at the cottonwood where he'd first found her, the scarred blanket folded and buried beneath the roots, and she told him she didn't feel filthy anymore, not inside, not out, and Caleb kissed her forehead like it was a promise instead of a claim, knowing destiny wasn't about what the world did to you, but what you chose to protect afterward. And if this story of survival, sacrifice, and hard-earned love stirred something in your chest, if you believe the Wild West was shaped as much by mercy as it was by blood, then ride with us by subscribing to Western Destiny Tales, because more forgotten souls are waiting in the dust, and their stories deserve to be told.